We are about to study for the final part of all our history lessons. We started in year 1 at prehistory. Then we learned about the Romans and the Middle Ages. In year 1 we studied explorers, enlightenment and revolutions. We learned about democracy, industrialization and wars. Thousands of years of history leads us all the way to our time today, the time of television and computer. In this chapter we will study the time after World War II. We already learned about decolonization, but there's more, a lot more. I will choose the subjects that I believe are the most important. But before we can start, we have to take a look at what we already have learned about our history, the history of the world. For this chapter, it's important to combine all your historical knowledge from previous years. We will go around the planet and into space. Here's a quick summary of history around the world. Let's start our world trip in Australia and New Zealand. So, what do we know about Australia and New Zealand? We know that they are wonderful countries with beautiful nature and people. These islands were first inhabited by Aboriginals and Maori. And during the 17th century, Dutch explorers discovered the islands. They didn't stay, but the British took over and made it their colony. Today, Australia and New Zealand belong to the West. They have a Western culture, just like the United States, Canada and Europe. We don't have to study anything about these continents for the test, but I just want to take a look at it for just a moment. The next continent is Antarctica. Antarctica has been controlled by ice, penguins, seals and whales for centuries, until Norwegian Roald Amundsen was able to reach the South Pole in 1911. Today Antarctica is controlled by scientists and penguins. Ice and whales have lost the war. Well, what do we need to know for the test? Nothing. Okay, this is fast and easy, but it becomes a little bit more difficult. What about Latin America? Well, Native Americans have been living in the mountains and jungles for centuries, but there also were highly developed cultures that developed, such as the Mayas, Incas and the Aztecs. Well, after Columbus reached America, the Spaniards followed him and took over the continent. They brought their language and religion, but they also stole gold and forced slaves to work on plantations. After the Spaniards, other European countries followed, such as the Portuguese, who founded Brazil, and the Netherlands, who took over Suriname. Well, during the time of television and computer, nationalist and communist dictators come to power. Some of them were supported by the United States or the USSR, the Soviet Union. So there was a struggle between the Soviet Union and America to control Latin America. So what do you need to study for the test about this continent? You need to know that both the United States and the Soviet Union, the USSR, wanted influence in South America. You also need to know that Cuba, which is a part of Latin America as well, it's Middle America, became a communist country and plays an important part in the Cold War. And you need to know about the decolonization of Suriname and the Antilles. Okay, so Corona is not going to stop us from making this world trip. We're going to take a look at another continent, Africa below the Sahara. So hunters, gatherers and farmers lived here for centuries. But since the 16th century, Europeans traded along the coast. Think about the Portuguese who were first to sail around Africa to Asia. Well, Europeans also took African slaves and brought them to America. This led to big demographic changes and war amongst the tribes. There were also Arab slave traders who also took slaves and brought them to the Middle East. Well, since the 19th century, European countries took over African countries as colonies. They divided the land, made boundaries, made borders, and waged war. And they stole the fossil fuels. This caused a lot of unrest in Africa, which still plays on until today. So what do we need to know for the test? During the time of television and computer, African countries became independent from European dominance. And African countries remain plagued by war, poverty and disease. Our next destination, the Middle East and North Africa. But be careful, there is still a lot of war and unrest in this area. So what can we tell about their history? Well, these are mainly desert countries. but great civilizations arose here, like Sumer in Mesopotamia or Egypt. Well, Islam was founded during the 7th century, and this religion is still an important factor for culture in this area. Most of these countries are Islamic cultures. So, the Ottoman Empire has ruled this area for centuries, but it fell apart after World War I, and from that moment European powers take over, especially Britain and France. And during the time of television and computer, you also need to know that the United States is going to play an important part in the Middle East, which we can still see on the news today. So what do you need to know for the test? After World War II, the Jewish state of Israel was founded in the Middle East. And what you also need to know is European countries and the United States have a lot of influence in this area during the 20th century. And there is still a lot of unrest about religion, fossil fuels, and independence of countries. And most of these countries are ruled by dictators or religious leaders. So this is a lot of information and it seems to look like a geography lesson. But you need to know these things because most of it will be repeated during the next lesson and will be seen on the test. So we're going to continue to Asia. Well, highly developed civilizations were founded in India, Japan, and China, and they traded along the Silk Route. Well, during the 16th century, again, like we've seen before, European powers take over the trade in spices, silk, and other luxury products. Well, this lasted for a few hundred years, but during the 19th century something changed. European powers took over these countries, also the inlands, and they founded colonies. They made them their colonies. European countries brought their culture, technology, and they also stole fossil fuels. Some of these Asian powers didn't accept colonialism anymore, such as Japan, and it became a superpower before and during World War II, only to be defeated by the United States at the end of the war. Today, China becomes a new superpower that we can hear more about in the future. So what do you need to know for the test? You need to know that Japan had become a Western country after the war. They were hit with an atomic bomb from the United States, they were brought to their knees, and from that moment they developed into a Western country just like the United States and Europe and Australia. Well, countries such as Indonesia, India and Vietnam became independent during the time of television and computer. China becomes a communist country during the time of television and computer, and a war between capitalist and communist is fought in Korea and Vietnam. So we have 3 more to go. Let's focus on Mother Russia, aka the Soviet Union, the USSR. It's the biggest country in the world. It was founded by Vikings, but for hundreds of years it was ruled by Tsars. Well, in 1917, that's an important year, when Lenin and his communists take over. They want to bring equality, a communist system, but they start a dictatorship. This dictatorship never stops. Russia gets a new name, the Soviet Union, the USSR. Well, in this USSR, nobody has personal possessions. Everything belongs to the state. That's why you can see these huge communal farms, and you can see that everybody lives in the same kind of apartment block. There is no freedom of speech. Stalin, who was dictator of the Soviet Union during World War II, defeated Hitler and Nazi Germany. So what do we need to know? After World War II, the USSR became a communist and nuclear superpower. The USSR also wanted to influence the rest of the world. But every leader in this country had a different policy. So we're going to take a look at Stalin, but also Brezhnev and Gorbachev. Those were different leaders of the Soviet Union. And now for the US of A and the rest of North America. Sorry, Canada. So Native American tribes were hunters and farmers until the Europeans arrived again during the 16th century. European countries took over, founded colonies. 13 of these colonies fought for independence against Britain. They won and they founded a new country, the United States of America. In the next centuries, they took over big areas in the West called the Wild West. And during the 20th century, the United States became a superpower. They became very rich and they win World War I and World War II. So what do we need to know for the test? We need to know that the United States became a capitalist superpower and they want to influence the rest of the world. And we should know that presidents have different policies. They vote every 4 years, so sometimes it's a Democrat as a president and sometimes it's a Republican as a president. So last but not least, Europe. Well, highly developed cultures arose on this small continent. The Romans, Charlemagne, Napoleon and Hitler, they all tried to conquer this continent, but they all failed. For centuries, Europe has been plagued by wars. Europeans traded all over the world since the 16th century. They brought their culture and they got really rich. During the 18th century, they got addicted to fossil fuels because of the Industrial Revolution. European countries conquered big parts of Africa and Asia, and they spread their culture. Think about Britain, think about the Netherlands, think about Spain and Belgium. World War I started in Europe in 1914, and that's why the continent got weakened. And World War II made an end to the global powers of European countries. So what do we need to know about Europe after the war? European colonies became independent. Europe after World War II is torn to pieces. Western countries become capitalist and fall into the influence of the United States, and the East become communist and become a part of the Soviet Union. Europe tried to make peace and to bring unity by founding the European Union. So that was a very quick summary of history around the world. With this information we can take a next step. Because for the first time in 3 years we're going to focus on multiple continents at the same time. So almost everything that we learn about now happens at the same time or within a short time period of 50 years. So let's start in 1945. It's the beginning of the time of television and computer. World War II was over. Japan and Germany had lost. The United States had shown their strength by using their secret weapon, the nuclear bomb. So this nuclear bomb was so destructive that it could destroy an entire city and cause radiation illness. Nobody had ever had a weapon like this before. Einstein and Oppenheimer had worked on the bomb that could only be made with the latest technology. When the first bomb exploded, Oppenheimer felt sad and quoted an old Hindu text. He said, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." So let's go to the next slide and into the Soviet Union. Stalin was furious when he heard about the bomb. He was ready to invade Japan, but the United States had done it by themselves, and now Japan became their vassal state. But he was also angry about the shift in power, because the Soviet Union didn't have a nuclear bomb, so they had a disadvantage in taking control over the world. Stalin started to force his scientists to make a bomb, and they succeeded in just 4 years. Well, spying and stealing helped a lot. So when it was known that Stalin had an atomic bomb, it became the start of an arms race. Both countries wanted to have as many bombs as possible, not thinking about the terrible effect of the bombs. So let's take a closer look at what actually can happen when you play with nuclear radiation. So what did scientists discover years after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Well, nuclear radiation fills the air and poisons your body. Your DNA is mutated when you are close. So this is not just for you, but also for your children. Cancer and mutations can be passed on to another generation. So when a bomb is dropped, it's not just a city that is destroyed, and not just thousands of deaths, but the survivors who are close are poisoned for life. This doesn't only happen with a bomb. In 1986, a nuclear power plant exploded in the Soviet Union at Chernobyl in Ukraine. Radiation and toxic air escaped and contaminated the area. A toxic cloud moved over Europe. Radiation levels are still so high at Chernobyl that it is not safe to live there. I mean, it's not even safe to be there. Wild animals and plants have taken over the city, and they are safe there, but most of them die early because of cancer and other mutations. So here's a quick tip about what to do in case of nuclear bombing or an accident in a power plant, because it can still happen today. So when you are close to the blast, the only thing you can do is pray. So when you are not close to the blast, if you're out of the blast zone, find shelter, and the best shelters are deep concrete basements. Avoid going outside because of fallout and radiation. Remove contaminated clothing and wash yourself. Take iodine tablets. Those are the tablets that we have at home because we got them from the government. There are some power plants in Germany. If something happens to them, you have to take these jodium tabletten in Dutch. So what you also have to do is listen to the media, listen to the radio, television, go online and wait for help. So there's even an old bunker in Emmen that is left from the Cold War. You can watch the video from RTV Drenthe if you think this is interesting. So nuclear bombings were serious during the time of television and computer, and it is still serious today. Multiple countries own these bombs. Russia and the United States have enough bombs to destroy the world 7 times. So for the first time in history, a species is able to destroy itself and the whole world. To protect the inhabitants, the USA made a nice video about this. It has Bert the Turtle as the main character. You should check it out, it's fun. So now that we know this, we will understand about how dangerous these times were. People never wanted to have another world war again. Albert Einstein once said, "I don't know what World War III will be like, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." He meant that another war would bring us back to the Stone Age. That is why in 1945 the United Nations were founded to avoid major wars. It started with 50 member states. Remember President Wilson and the League of Nations after World War I? That failed, but the United States was another try. So it's not perfect, but up until today it helped to avoid major wars. The Council always changes, but there are 5 permanent members who have the right to veto. The United States, Soviet Union, China, France and Great Britain. So nothing happens if one of those do not agree. This is why the United Nations sometimes is also a place for dirty politics. Well, the United Nations lets countries talk to each other instead of fighting against each other, and they sometimes send blue helmets, soldiers, to protect areas that are in war. You can also have a chance to experience the United Nations because at school we always participate in the Model United Nations. This is a day for teenagers to discuss politics. So a few more things. The United Nations was founded, but in 1945 the leaders of the Allies already met in Yalta. They talked about what to do with the world after the war. It became clear that a new war was already starting, a war between the United States and the USSR, the Soviet Union, America versus Soviet Union. So let's go to the next slide. So these two superpowers remained after the war, and they hated each other's ideologies, the way to govern a country. And they thought that the other would take over the world. And they were right about each other, because both countries wanted to be world leaders. The United States wanted to spread capitalism, and the USSR wanted to spread communism. Conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union is called the Cold War. It was a Cold War because the two didn't really fight directly. It was mainly an arms race. Both countries wanted to influence as many countries as possible and have the best technology, weapons, art, sports, etc. It was like a global competition in everything. So what were these two ideologies? So let's take a look at capitalism first. Capitalism is known for freedom, freedom of speech. You can do whatever you want. You can be who you want. You can even vote for your leaders. There's democracy. But the main thing about capitalism is making profit is important. So if you start a company, you have to make profit. You have to pay your workers. And if you don't have enough money, you will go bankrupt. So those that work hard or are talented have a chance to become rich, which also means that there's a huge difference in wealth. Some people are incredibly rich, some people are poor. Well, tolerance and individualism are okay, you are free to be who you want to be. That's a difference if we look at communism, because in communism, equality is important. Everybody should be equal. So everybody should get the same amount of money. Nobody should be poor. So the idea of communism is you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't be jealous because everybody has the same amount of possessions. Well, in the Soviet Union, this resulted in a dictatorship of the Communist Party, and the state owned everything. So a person is not an individual. In communism, a person is like a small part in the machine. There, you are not different from anyone else. You just work together to make your country strong. So the last slide, but not the least, try to look at this map and remember it the best you can. This is what capitalism versus communism looked like in the world. We started with all the continents, and we end with this. So after 1945, the world was divided in three groups. You have the first world, capitalist, rich countries under the leadership of the United States, the West, which is shown in blue. The second world, the communist countries led by the Soviet Union, which we will also call the East, and the Third World, which were poor developing countries and old colonies of Europe. And they were on both sides. Sometimes they were Catholic, sometimes they became communist. So capitalism and communism fought for influence in the green countries, but also in each other's areas. So, a quick summary. During the time of television and computer, the world was divided in East and West, capitalist and communist. Countries had to make a choice who to support or not to support anybody at all. At the same time, both sides were able to destroy the whole world with nuclear bombs. This is scary as hell. So let's end with some pictures of animals experiencing another Cold War. See you again next time.
Песню заводила про степного сизого горла.